meant when he said that. I think he meant that more or less than this gets in the way of my testing purposes. And I also attest to you that his testing purposes have been fulfilled. That in fact we're losing our freedom, if not lost it, even though they haven't announced it to us and haven't actually started to lock up many people. We have lost our freedom because they have the power to take it away. And they're only waiting for a sufficient crisis to have the excuse to do it, so that people cannot and will not rebel. And I think a future nuclear war will in fact be that crisis. And that's why they're covering for the war preparations of Russia and China as we speak. They want a war of such devastating purposes that when they come out and then nuclear weapons fly and destroy millions of people, they will come out of their bunkers and say, our military has been destroyed and we have no choice but to form into a new world order to defend us in a glorious new Third World War, a patriotic war just like World War II. And sadly, most Americans will fall for that. But that's what I think that they're headed. And I think we have to be prepared for things like that, to be able to reinstill liberty in pockets of resistance. You know, so often we as conservatives get discouraged about talking to our neighbors about things, and I don't frankly try. I don't talk to anyone unless I sense that they're disturbed. I sense that they feel that something's wrong. That's a sign to me that the Spirit of the Lord is working through their conscience to make them feel that something's wrong. But people who are fat, dumb, and happy in life and don't sense that anything's wrong, that trust the establishment, I don't even try. It's up to the Lord to test them first to see if they'll respond to at least the promptings that something's wrong. Then I can deal with them. And if you'll take that tact as well, to search for the remnants, to search for people that you can influence, who will be open to truth, then I think that you'll be less frustrated in life. That's how I live with all of the knowledge that I have, which exceeds some of yours. But I believe strongly that we have to do our homework. We have to understand how to structure liberty. Even though I love the Constitution for what it is and for what it gave us, I want you to understand that the reason a great deal of our liberties were preserved for 100 years and that they only started to be is because we had a laissez-faire tradition in America. In the colonies, for example, people were used to doing pretty much what they want. It took them 200 years to ratchet down the regulations. It took them 200 years because of the general language, and it was fairly clear at those days what was intended. It was intended that government would be hands-off. So every time government tried to get restrictive and regular, the people naturally resist. It's that resistance, not the specific language of the Constitution per se. It's the resistance of people to increasing government regulations that slowed them down for so many years. And that's why they have had to evade rebellion. And that's why they're so worried about the Tea Party now. They see that as a wave of rebellion. And so they've got to capture it. They've got to pander to it. They've got to quote the Constitution to it to get you to just settle down and have confidence in the same Republican puppets that George Bush and Dick Cheney were that will take over and give us the same thing that Obama is. Oh, they'll change a few things. They'll make a few modifications at Obamacare, but essentially it will never be fully repealed. That's my prediction. And so while we continue to try to fight for our liberties within the system, we must also prepare for a takedown. We must prepare for the day of crisis. We must prepare for the time when, if we have an opportunity in that crisis to reestablish liberty, we do it with tighter safeguards, with tighter language. And you can't do that in a Utah legislature was filled with people who are believers in existing precedent. You have to have a different document so that they can't apply their precedent to it. And it has to have wide agreement beforehand. And that's why I want to encourage you to think. It obviously takes more than just a small group like this, but we have to start small. We have to start with good people who understand the nuances of law and the difficult issues of law, because that's what it takes to write. And I'm going to give you now, at this point in my presentation, a few examples. I've been working at this for the past 5 or 10 years of how to rewrite the Constitution in tight legal language. And I want to expose you just to some of the feeling of what it is. It isn't to say that what I've written is perfect. It isn't to say that what I've written is something you have to accept. It's just an example. And you can feel, as I read through some of these examples, as you compare the existing constitutional language, oh yes, you see, that's what that tightens up. Oh yes, that does this and that does that. That cures this sovereignty problem, it cures the public school problem, etc. So I want to give you just a few feelings of those things. This is from my proposed constitutional revision. And once again, remember, I'm not talking about a constitutional convention. I'm talking about a ground up where people read and agree and converse, and we start to build a consensus. You know, as much as I love the Constitution, what I was going to say is that I hold no allegiance to any particular language if it doesn't actually defend liberty. In other words, we have to do whatever it takes. As sophisticated as the world gets in taking away our liberty, we got to get as sophisticated in designing legal language to stop it. And my biggest problem is the fact that I have people come up and say, but the Constitution is perfect. Your uncle told me it was perfect. Now, bless my uncle. He's a wonderful patriot, and this conference is going to honor him with an award which is well-deserved. But my only suggestion is when you teach the Constitution, teach the principles which are valid, and they are still valid. But don't teach that the language is perfect, and anyone who deviates or tries to improve upon it is anathema to it or is an enemy of the Constitution, because that's not true. Anyone who knows my principles and my intents knows that I am not an enemy of this doctrine, but I desperately want to tighten up and strengthen the language that it can be enforced. And additionally, I want to cut the umbilical cord between existing legal precedent and the document. And the only way you do that, and believe me, you try it the other way. You go and try head-to-head, and the lawyers will say, well, you go and interpret. Tell me how you'd interpret Heller versus this, and the Kelo case versus the eminent domain. And you disagree with that portion of the domain, but how about this? And what would you do to replace it with? I mean, these are tough legal questions. You don't even want to go down that route. It would take you 30 years to even get through the documents. But if you change it to tight legal language, all of a sudden they have to come into your ballpark. They have to argue on your language. But we need a fairly large group of conservatives to buy into new language. That's not an easy process. I'm not saying it's easy. But I want to enthuse you with what can be done by just giving you some samples of language. First of all, I start out with some sovereign principles. And I might say in terms of structure, I have removed from my version of a rewrite of the Constitution something called a citizenship compact. No longer would citizenship be by birth, that everybody has to pass a basic test on the Constitution. Now, it's an open book test, meaning you don't care where you get the information, you don't have to have a doctorate, you don't have to be really smart, you just have to know the difference between good and bad law and what's unconstitutional and not in terms of basic principles. And you don't require anyone to do that in school. You don't say, you know, you've got to get it from this authorized school. You say, get it anywhere you want. Here's the material. Here's the open book. You don't need a teacher. But you just got to know the difference between right and wrong in terms of law before we give you the power to vote as a citizen. Before we give you the power to vote and take away people's rights, you've got to know and commit to what's right. And that's what a citizenship covenant document does. It basically signs on the dotted line, I agree with the principles of these are the fundamental rights, and then I will vow to defend these rights. And it gives you a basis, essentially, upon which to judge people. One of the interesting things about a tight constitution, by the way, is that it avoids the problem of term limits. I am not in favor of term limits as a means of controlling government, because term limits do one great damage to our cause. It's 10 times easier to produce a liberal to run for Congress than it is to produce a Ron Paul. Believe me, after being in politics for many years, I'll tell you that's absolutely true, by a factor of 100 to 1. And term limits take care of all the good guys. They're the only ones who really do get out, and the bad guys keeps flowing in. And it's very difficult to keep relating them. But if you change and rewrite the Constitution in tight legal language, what do? You can elect a communist to Congress, and he can't do anything because it's all prohibited. You see the danger of, the greatness of tightening up the language. It's not as important to have perfection in the leaders that you elect because they can't do anything once they're there. And the judges can't interpret them away as well because it's tight legal language. So that's one of the things I do, is take into a citizenship covenant document That means when you have children, they're citizens while they're in your home, but when they become of their own age, they have to take the test themselves and become citizens. And everyone who comes into the country has to just like a test, and it's an easy test. It isn't something that requires that people have a great deal of knowledge, but it does put everybody on a central plane, doesn't it? And so you don't have to worry about whether or not the public schools teach it or not. It's required for citizenship. You've given them a massive incentive to learn it, and they can learn it anywhere as long as they pass the test. It's that simple. Now, liberals will decry, oh, we can't have that. People with inability to pass these tests can't be denied citizenship. Yes, they can, and the founders believed in that. Because you don't give people the right to vote, which is to take away rights and to tax and things, unless they understand the law to a basic degree. Now, in terms of the Constitution, you have to set aside certain sovereign principles at first. And the Constitution doesn't do this. It needs to be done.
The first principle of sovereignty that we must address in a Constitution is the sovereignty of the individual. And then we'll address the sovereignty of the family. But as to the individual, we establish its sovereignty by creating a definition, a workable definition of individual rights. Now, the Bill of Rights is merely a recitation of certain common law rights that the founders used. It doesn't stop Congress, because it doesn't have a definition or a criteria, from Congress or judges or the people even from creating false rights through an amendment to the Constitution. So there are two criteria that are essential for the definition of a fundamental right. The first is that it must be universal to all. And second, it must be non-conflicting. That is, you can't have a certain right that will conflict with another person's right. So all rights, if they're going to be fundamental, have to be non-conflicting. So with these two criteria in mind, we can create an adjudicable definition. And this is what I would suggest. Fundamental rights are those rights that everyone can claim simultaneously without forcing others to serve their needs.
Now, what does that do? It's a magic criteria. It's a magic definition because it stops them from declaring food, medical care, legal care, and other things as fundamental rights. You can't claim anything unless everybody can simultaneously claim that without forcing someone to serve their needs. So can everyone claim the right to medical care? No, because somebody's got to force them to provide the doctors, the hospitals, the medical facilities. Can you all claim a right to an education? No, because somebody's got to force people to teach and to build the buildings, etc. So these are not fundamental rights. So we have life, liberty, ownership, self-defense, and other corollary rights that do meet this definition. These fundamental rights, securing the innate liberties inherent in the unique life of every person, shall never be subjected to majority rule. It's right there in the Constitution. In other words, the majority can't take these away. That's why you sign on to them individually when you join and become a citizen. They're not subject to majority rule. And if you don't agree with them, you don't have to become a citizen. You can be a non-citizen. You don't have the same privileges as a citizen or protections, but you can be that. We're not forcing anyone to join. Second, this Constitution recognizes the special sovereignty that parents possess over the health, welfare, and education of their minor children until those children are capable of being responsible for themselves. Now, what does that do for us? It's tremendous because right now the Constitution doesn't give any parental rights. It's only by interpretation. And that's why I have so many problems with child protective services, terminating your rights, and they'll get more ruthless in the future, especially when they view as discipline or a certain religious philosophy, as they did in the fundamentalist LDS, is anathema to being a parent, and therefore you can't be a parent. Someday it'll be, if you don't believe in vaccinating children, you'll be deemed unfit as a parent. Well, you've got to protect parental rights in the Constitution, and that's basic statements of sovereignty. There are specific language, which I have in a document, which tells how to specifically protect those. A fourth principle, majority rule may not be used to cause a sovereign individual or parent to yield or diminish a fundamental right except as consented to and specified in the Citizenship Compact. This has to do with the problem of unalienable rights or inalienable rights. This is a concept that came from a religious doctrine which is frankly incorrect. Now, I realize a lot of you who have Christian backgrounds will be abhorred that I will attack the doctrine of unalienable God-given rights. In the first place, even though I believe that God wants us to have our rights, he never wrote them down. He never specified. So when you go around saying God given specified rights, you've got a real problem with non-churchgoers. They want to know where it's written. And they want proof that God actually said it. It just can't be done. It's not necessary as well. We can write rights so that they're all protected even without making reference to God. And while you may object that we need to make reference to God, I allow for it in what I've written in this revised Constitution, but I don't mandate that anyone have to accept God. You see, you have to have a broad Constitution that protects everybody's rights, even atheists, as long as they don't take away our right to express ourselves religiously in a public setting as well, and I provide for that. But the point is that there is no such thing as an inalienable right. An inalienable right is the religious construct that what God has given you, man cannot give away. So if God gave us your rights, you can't give those rights away, and it's absolutely false. Every time you make a contract to limit your rights, you give away a portion of your fundamental rights. When you, for example, obligate yourself to a 30-year mortgage, you're no longer free to walk away from it. You are bound and chained as a slave to serve that contract because you made it. You can give away portions of your rights by contract. That's what part of free agency in life. Agency is about the right to contract and even limit your rights. When you agree, for example, as we should, to certain very limited structures of eminent domain in property law, the Constitution should defend property as inalienable, as a fundamental right. But you can and should alienate, that means give up some of those rights, sign some of those rights away for the good of the society. If, for example, government could not, in a crucial military area necessary to defend the nation, take possession of the property in the common defense because of a property right, having a horse on the property, say, I'm just not giving it up. And property is absolutely inviolate. It is. And you shouldn't be able to take away property rights by majority rule. That's why I suggest as part of the Citizenship Compact that you do put in the limitations and the yielding, a partial yielding of rights as necessary to make a government operate like very restrictive, and I mean very restrictive eminent domain, not the kind of thing that came out in the Kelo case whereby any government can take private property and give it to a developer because it's in the general public interest. I don't believe in that. But you see, you need to develop any infringement on fundamental rights needs to be agreed upon, not by majority rule, but by each individual as part of the citizenship covenant. For example, it's improper to have a draft. A draft is involuntary servitude. And yet it is important that each person defend. So I suggest as part of the agreement to become a citizen that you agree to a certain limiting military service that excludes women as part of that. You know, we can design anything we need to be reasonable as a limitation on our rights, part of fulfilling our covenant responsibilities, but we need to cede them person by person, each person on the same basis, coming in on the exact same basis of everyone else. That's what we mean by the principle of initial unanimous consent, not by majority rule. Some things are improper ever to do by majority rule. And that's what I mean here by except as specified in a citizenship contract. Number 5, this is a very important principle. In forming a government and empowering it to act as our agent, the individual does not cease to be sovereign within his own sphere of ownership or upon public property as long as he is not infringing upon the rights of another person's. For example, that principle allows you that because you give governments the power to defend you, you don't give up your individual right to defend yourself. And there is a principle in socialist law that basically you empower the government to be your defendant. You have no more rights to defend. You have to wait till the police arrives. I don't believe that. When an individual has the right to self-defend and he cedes, or not cedes, but empowers government to act as his agent, he doesn't lose his fundamental right to defend himself. And those need to be very carefully stated in the Constitution. And then principle number 7, should this government violate or fail to defend these rights or exceed the powers granted herein, Any sovereign individual acting separately or jointly retains the right to secede from this union and withdraw their participation and support. So in other words, we put back into the Constitution the Declaration of Independence. Isn't that what it did? We have the right, when a government begins to infringe upon these rights, to secede. But in the same spirit of the Declaration, however, the right of revolution shall not be engaged in for light and transient reasons, but only when the government engages in repeated violent offenses against life and property of its citizens, contrary to the rights herein guaranteed, and where citizens so agree to have put forth their grievances before duly elected officials in the courts, and those petitions for redress have been ignored and rejected without proper justification. Now, we're getting close to that. You notice that we put forth grievances to Congress on the tax laws to have them clarify and change that. And Congress has refused to hear the petitions of grievances of various tax protesters. And while I don't encourage tax protests because I think it's a trap, in principle they are correct. I'm saying the only reason that they have not changed the tax code, it would take them 15 minutes in a tax writing committee to change the code and make sure that it says who's liable to file. Why haven't they done it in 30, 50 years of tax protest? Because it's a trap. They want to keep luring constitutional conservatives into the trap so they can put you in jail. That's why they don't correct the deficiencies in the law. Now, a lot of people have claimed that they need it themselves, and it's just not true. It's a trap, and be careful to avoid those things. Now, general limitations on government power. This is an important principle that I'm suggesting. This federal Constitution puts forth the minimum limitations on lawmaking power that are necessary to defend fundamental rights at any level of government within these United States. Therefore, the following specific limitations on government apply not only at the federal level, but to all states, counties, cities, and any other subunit of government formed by majority rule. Now, that's very important, because tyranny can come just as easy at the county level as it can at the state level. It's true you can influence it a little bit easier, but still you've got to bind all levels of government down to the defense of fundamental rights. Let me give you some other specifics here. One thing about how do you separate government from church and state, those issues. I think a reasonable statement in a constitution would be something like this. Government officials shall not be restricted from making general references to a duty to God or a belief in a supreme being or praying publicly to God, as long as such pronouncements are stated as their own beliefs or feelings that represent part of his or her leadership role to constituents. Officials shall not, however, in an official capacity, publicly disparage the beliefs of others, except those beliefs that undermine and attack the fundamental rights secured in this Constitution. All non-coercive values shall be free to compete for adherence in the private domain without government interference or funding. Now, that's the example. It may not be perfect, but that's an example of detailed language that really clarifies. And suddenly the Supreme Courts cannot say that you can't pray, or you can't make reference to God, or that you can't have a Ten Commandments, because leaders are able to make those as long as, now, it's true they would not be able to use public funds if they wanted to have a public monument to religion. They'd get private donations, but they can put it in public parks and in front of Supreme Courts just like is proper. Listen to this on the individual right to keep and bear arms. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed or limited as to type, quantity, or type of ammunition, as long as the citizen is not acting or intending to commit a crime against the rights of others, nor shall any government authority require personal weapons or ammunition to be registered or licensed. It says it right out. It just flat prohibits it. We need that kind of language. The burden of proof for any restriction upon an individual's right to bear arms as an imminent threat to society is upon the government on a case-to-case basis. Citizens may defend themselves and others by the appropriate force necessary to repel a direct and imminent threat to any person's body or property when no immediate recourse is available to a law enforcement officer. Now think what that would do to gun rights. You can use any force necessary of the weapons immediately in hand to defend yourself when immediate recourse is not available for law enforcement. It gives you the absolute right to defend yourself. You don't have to worry about dragging the body inside your house. There's nothing here about It has to be inside or outside. You just have the right when there's but you will have to show what the threat was, and there'll be questions because you have to be able to distinguish between that. But you've got to very much expand people's ability to defend themselves. There should be no restriction upon the free movement of any citizen in good standing within the nation, either for personal travel or establish a personal residence, or to leave the country or any jurisdiction therein with any and all assets owned, as long as the citizens abide by voluntary contracts made, uniform regulations common to all pertaining to the public use of property, and is not fleeing from lawful criminal or civil action. And what does all that mean? Well, that has to do with like South Africa. When the communist ANC government took over, thousands of South Africans wanted to leave. And what happened? They said, you can't take your money with you. In the Soviet Union, they couldn't even physically leave. In East Germany, they had fences and borders up. This prohibits government from ever restricting, allows you to leave the country if you want with your assets as long as you're not running from the law through illegal violation of contracts. No law should be made requiring the registration of taxation or restriction of any association of persons desiring to promote or share common beliefs, as long as such association is voluntary and the actions of its members do not infringe or imminently threaten the fundamental rights of others. Now, what does that do? That's a religious freedom section. And it also means that you can't tax churches. Any association of persons, for any reason, any money that they give is tax-free. You just can't tax associations. And they're free to promote their beliefs. They're free to involve themselves in politics. There should be no restriction against churches or anything because they're acting as an association of persons. And the same rights you have as a person carry with you, whether you're a member of a lobbying organization or as a religious group or a political party. Government shall make no law requiring mandatory education of any private person. Now, this does not preclude any government's right to train its own employee or set qualifications for official service or citizenship, but you shall not mandate education. Now, that's very, very important because mandatory education is a violation of your freedom. You must have the freedom to fail, as my uncle Cleon Skousen talked about. Freedom to fail is essential because if you open the door to allow people to stop you from taking risks and stop you from failing, you have lost one of the great essential freedoms. No law shall interfere in the economic choices and decisions of any person except where fraud or misrepresentation is present, or where such